Vol.76. The reverse wave of 1939 was an unheard of incident in the history of the organs, a blot on their record. But in fact, this reverse wave was not large. It included about 1 to 2% of those who had been arrested but not yet convicted, who had not yet been sent away to far-off places and had not yet perished. It was not large, but it was put to effective use. It was like giving back 1 kopeck of change from a ruble, and it was necessary in order to heap all the blame on that dirty Yezhov, to strengthen the newcomer Beria, and to cause the leader himself to shine more brightly. With this kopeck, they skillfully drove the ruble right into the ground. After all, if they had sorted things out and freed some people, and even the newspapers wrote intrepidly about individual cases of persons who had been slandered, it meant that the rest of those arrested were indeed scoundrels, and those who returned kept silent. They had signed pledges not to speak out. They were mute with terror. And there were a few who knew even a little about the secrets of the archipelago. The distinction was, as before, black marias at night and demonstrations by day. But for that matter, they soon took that kopeck back. During those same years, via those same sections of the boundless Article 58, who in 1940 noticed the wave of wives arrested for the failure to renounce their husbands, and who in Tambov remembers that during that year of peace they arrested an entire jazz orchestra for playing at the Modern Cinema Theater because they all turned out to be enemies of the people, and who noticed 30,000 Czechs who in 1939 fled from occupied Czechoslovakia to their Slavic kinfolk in the USSR. It was impossible to guarantee that a single one of them was not a spy. They sent them all off to northern camps, and it was out of those camps that the Czechoslovak Corps materialized during the war. And was it not indeed in 1939 that we reached out our helping hands to the West Ukrainians and the West Belarusians, and in 1940 to the Baltic states and to the Moldovians? It turns out that our brothers badly needed to be purged, and from them too flowed waves of social prophylaxis. They took those who were too independent, too influential, along with those who were too well-to-do, too intelligent, too noteworthy. They took particularly many Poles from former Polish provinces. It was then that ill-fated Katyn was filled up, and then too, in northern camps they stockpiled fodder for the future army of Sikorsky and Anders. They arrested officers everywhere. Thus the population was shaken up, forced into silence, and left without any possible leaders of resistance. Thus it was that wisdom was instilled, that former ties and former friendships were cut off. Finland ceded its isthmus to us with zero population. Nevertheless, the removal and settlement of all persons with Finnish blood took place throughout Soviet Karelia and in Leningrad in 1940. We didn't notice that way, but we have no Finnish blood. In the Finnish War, we took our first experiment in convicting our war prisoners as traitors to the motherland. The first such experiment in human history. Would you believe it? We didn't notice. That was a rehearsal. Just at that moment, the war burst upon us, and with it, a massive retreat. It was essential to evacuate swiftly. Everyone who could got out of the Western republics that were being abandoned to the enemy. In the rush, entire military units, regiment, anti-aircraft, and artillery batteries were left behind intact in Lithuania, but they still managed to get out. Several thousand families of unreliable Lithuanians. 4,000 of them were subsequently turned over to be plundered by the thieves in camp at Krasnoyarsk from June 23rd on in Latvia and Estonia. They speeded up the arrests, but the ground was burning under them, and they were forced to leave even faster. They forgot to take the whole fortress with them, like the one at Brest, but they did not forget to shoot down political prisoners in the cell and the courtyards of Lvov, Rovna, Tallinn, and many other Western prisons. In the Ch.2 prison, they shot 192 prisoners and threw their corpses down a well. How can one visualize it? You know nothing. The door to your cell opens and they shoot you. You cry out in your death agony and there is no one to hear your cries or tell of them except prison stones. They say, however, that there were some who weren't successfully finished off, and we may someday read a book about that too. In the rear, the first wartime wave was for those spreading rumors and panic. That was the language of a special decree outside the code issued in the first days of the war. This was just trial bloodletting in order to maintain a general state of tension. They gave everyone 10 years for it, but it was not considered part of Article 58, and therefore the few of those who survived the wartime camps were amnestied in 1945. Then there was a wave of those who failed to return in radio receivers or radio parts. For one radio tube found as a result of denunciation, they gave 10 years. Then there was a wave of Germans living on the Volga, colonists in the Ukraine and the North Caucasus, and all Germans who lived anywhere in the Soviet Union. The determining factor here was blood, and even the heroes of the Civil War and old members of the party who were German were sent into exile. In essence, the exile of the Germans was similar to the dispossession of the kulaks, but it was less harsh since the Germans were allowed to take more of their possessions with them and were not sent off to such fatal, deadly areas. As had been the case with the kulaks, the German exile had no juridical basis. The criminal code itself was one thing, and the exile of hundreds of thousands of people was something else entirely. It was personal edict of a monarch. In addition, this was the first experiment of the sort with an entire nationality, and he found it extremely interesting from a theoretical point of view. By the end of the summer of 1941, coming bigger in autumn, the wave of the encircled was surging in. These were the defenders of their native land, the very warriors whom the cities had sent off to the front with brigades and vans a few months ago, before the war, who had then sustained the heaviest tank assaults of the Germans, and in the general chaos, and through no fault of their own, had spent a certain time as isolated units, not in enemy imprisonment, not at all, but in temporary encirclement, and later had broken out. But instead of being given a brotherly embrace on their return, such as every other army in the world would have given them, instead of being given a chance to rest up to visit their families, and then return to their units, they were held on suspicion, disarmed, deprived of all rights, and taken away in groups to identification points and screening centers, where officers of the special branches started interrogating them, distrusting not only their every word but their very identity. Identification consisted of cross-questioning, confrontations, pitting the evidence against one another. Afterwards, some of those who had been encircled were restored to their former names, ranks, and responsibilities and went off to military units. Others, fewer in number at the start, constituted the first wave of traitors of the motherland under 58(1)(b). But at first, until the standard penalty was firmly determined, they got less than 10 years. That was how the active army was kept purged. But there was also an enormous inactive army in the Far East and in Mongolia. And it was the noble task of the special branches to keep that army from growing rusty. And for lack of anything to do, the heroes of the Khakin Gol and the Kazan began to let their tongues wag, especially after they were permitted to examine the Getaret automatic pistols and the regimental mortars, which until then had been kept secret even from Soviet soldiers. With such weapons in their hand, it was hard for them to understand why they were retreating in the west. With all of Siberia and the Urals between them and European Russia, it's not easy for them to grasp that in retreating 70 miles a day, we were simply repeating the Kutuzov entrapment maneuver. Their comprehension could be helped along only by means of a wave from the Eastern Army. And at that point lips tightened and faith became steely. It was obvious that a wave had also to roll in high places, those to blame for the retreat. After all, it was not the great strategist who was at fault. It was a small wave, just 100 men, a general's wave. They were in Moscow prisons by the summer of 1941. In October 1941, they were sent off on a prisoner transport. Most of the generals were from the Air Force. Among them were Air Force commanders Sewage and General Petuchkin, who was known to have said, "If I had known, I would have first bombed our dear father and then gone off to prison." And there were others. The victory outside Moscow gave rise to a new wave, guilty Muscovites. Looking at things after the event, it turned out that those Muscovites who had not run away and who had not been evacuated had fearlessly remained in the threatened capital, which had been abandoned by the authorities, were by that very token under suspicion of either subverting governmental authority, 5810, or staying on to await the Germans, 58-1AFI-19, a wave which kept on providing fodder for the interrogators of Moscow and Leningrad right up to 1945. Hardly needed to be said that 5810 anti-Soviet agitation, ASA, never let up, but hovered over the front and in the rear throughout the war. Sentences under 5810 were handed out to evacuees who talked about the horrors of the retreat. It was clear from the newspapers that the retreat was proceeding according to plan. To those in the rear who were guilty of the slanderous rumor that rations were meager, to those at the front who were guilty of the slanderous rumor that the Germans had excellent equipment, and to those everywhere who, in 1942, were guilty of the slanderous rumor that people were dying of starvation in blockaded Leningrad. During that same year, after the disasters at Kerch, 120,000 prisoners, Kharkov even more, in the course of the big southern retreat to the Caucasus and the Volga. Another very important wave of officers and soldiers was pumped through. Those who refused to stand to the death and who retreated without permission. The men whom the words of Stalin's immortal order number 227, Motherland could not forgive for the shame they had caused her. This wave, however, never reached the Gulag. After accelerated processing by division tribunals, it was to a man herded into punishment battalions and was soaked up in the red sand of advanced positions, leaving not a trace. That's what cemented the foundation of the Stalingrad victory, but it has found no place in usual Russian history and exists only in the private history of the sewage system. Incidentally, we are here trying to identify only those waves which came into Gulag from outside. It was, after all, an incessant internal recirculation from reservoir to reservoir through the system of so-called sentencing in camp, which was particularly rampant during the war years. But we are not considering those in this chapter. Conscientiousness requires that we recall also the reserve waves of wartime, previously mentioned Czechs and Poles who were released, as well as the criminals released for service at the front. From 1943 on, when the war turned in our favor, there began the multi-million wave formed from occupied territories and from Europe, which got larger every year up to 1946. Its two main divisions were civilians who had lived under Germans or among Germans, hung with a tenor under letter A of 58-1A, and military personnel who had been POWs, who were nailed with a tenor under the letter 58-1B. Everyone living under the occupation wanted, of course, to survive, and therefore could not remain with hands folded, and thereby theoretically earned, along with his daily bread, a future sentence, if not for treason to the motherland, then at least for aiding and abetting the enemy. However, in actual practice, it was enough to note in the passport serial number that a person had been in occupied territory. To arrest all such persons would have been, from an economic point of view, irrational, because it would have depopulated such enormous areas. All that was required in order to heighten the general consciousness was to arrest a certain percentage of those guilty, those half guilty, those quarter guilty, and those who had hung out their footcloths to dry on the same branches of Germans. After all, even 1% of just 1 million fills up a dozen full-blooded camps, and dismiss the thought that honorable participation in an underground anti-German organization would surely protect one from being arrested in this way. More than one case proved this. For instance, there was, was the key Komsomol member whom the underground organization sent to serve in Kiev police during the German occupation in order to obtain inside info. The boy kept the Komsomol honestly informed about everything, but when our forces arrived on the scene, he got his tenor because he couldn't, while serving in the police, fail to acquire some of the enemy's spirit, or to carry out some enemy orders. Those who were in Europe got the stiffest punishments of all, even though they were conscripted as conscripted German slaves. That was because they had seen something of European life and could talk about it. Their stories, which made unpleasant listening for us, except of course for those travel notes of sensible writers, were especially unpleasant during the post-war years of ruin and disorganization. Not everyone, after all, was able to report that things in Europe were hopelessly bad, and that it was absolutely impossible to live there. That also was the reason why they sentenced the majority as war prisoners. It was not simply because they had allowed themselves to be captured, particularly those POWs who had seen a little more of the West than a German death camp. This was obvious from the fact that the interned persons were sentenced as severely as POWs. For example, during the first days of the war, one of our destroyers went aground on Swedish territory. Its crew proceeded to live freely in Sweden during all the rest of the war, and in such comfort and plenty as they had never experienced before and would never experience again. The USSR retreated, attacked, starved, and died, and while those little scoundrels stuffed their neutral mugs. After the war, Sweden returned them to us along with their destroyer. Their treason to the motherland was indubitable, but somehow the case didn't get off the ground. They let them go their different ways, and then pasted them with anti-Soviet agitation for their lovely stories of parades and freedom and good eating in capitalist Sweden. This was the Krenko group. I have to read about that. That's the end. Stop reading there, but sounds interesting. Krenko group. About that. Thank you for listening. Good night.